Greetings, welcome to the show. This is the overview, and I'm your host, Brother Mbogo. Today I'm going to take a look at a subject which I covered last time, but I covered more the political side of the BRICS group, or I could call it an organization, but it's more like a grouping of countries. So I'll be looking at some of the economic structures and the infrastructure, and some of the positives and negatives, and some of the issues as to why the BRICS institutions are at the stage that they're at the current time. So the two main institutions I'll be looking at are its banking infrastructure and its, they're both banking infrastructures, but one is more lending for projects and the other one is for lending to governments, similar to the World Bank and the IMF, which I'll also be touching on. So in 2014, the BRICS formed an alternative structure, the New Development Bank and the Contingency Reserve Arrangement, both of which are operating today, but the stage of their operating is what we're going to look at, what I'll be looking at. I'll also be looking at one of the former employees of the BRICS, of the New Development Bank, and he was also involved in the IMF, gentleman by the name of Paulo Nogueira Batista. There'll be some of his comments in terms of his insights as to some of the issues within that organization or within those institutions. So first of all, I think we'll define what these BRICS institutions are, being first of all, in fact, prior to the formation of the BRICS in 2015, the initiative to establish the CRA, or this Contingency Reserve Arrangement, was launched in 2012 by the BRICS leaders at the margins of G20 Summit in Mexico. That was in 2012. But the actual formation of these institutions didn't start until actually between 2015 and 2014. So Russia took a step further in implementing these strategies. And in 2015, they established these two multilateral institutions, the New Development Bank and this CRA, I'll call it. So this NDB also includes several non-BRICS countries, not just the 5 BRICS countries of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But there are countries outside of the BRICS who were not members yet, or at the time even were not intending to be members, but they were still part of that financial, still members of the bank, I should say. Even though according to what is stated here is stated coming from the People's Bank of China, is a statement regarding the formation of the bank, of the NDB. And basically it's saying that the NDB is currently still undercapitalized, which means it hasn't reached its full potential. In fact, it's a long way off its full potential. And it's only at around a third of the funds the World Bank, about a third of what the World Bank gives annually is what the total amount that the NDB has given since it started in 2014. So it still has a long way to go. And more recently, Russia is looking at forming a new structure in terms of international payments between BRICS countries, in terms of the cross-border payment initiative. What we have at the moment, especially since after the war in Ukraine started, you find that Russia was sanctioned by the US, so it was not part of the SWIFT, this American-based payment system which banks use to pay internationally. So Russia was removed from that, so it set up its own system, as China did, and I think also Iran. So some individual countries have set up their own system, but what Russia is talking about this year is setting up a broader BRICS-wide system for countries to make payments between their central banks. This was made at the Kazan Summit, which took place in October. So that's in terms of defining what these organizations are. Well, there's the two banks plus this initiative, but I'll be focusing mainly on the two banks. And the reasons why these institutions were formed is because the systems that were in place and are still in place, and they dominate the global financial network or infrastructure, is these Bretton Woods organizations or banks, the IMF and the World Bank Group. So these were formed in 1944 at the Bretton Woods conference, in which the dollar was made the global world currency or global reserve currency. So in order to counteract these Western-dominated organizations, the BRICS decided to set up, not necessarily to counteract, to provide an alternative for the global South because of the problems that they've been having with these Western-based organizations or structures. They've decided to set up alternative routes to gain the type of financial assistance that they would like to seek. So basically, these Bretton Woods institutions what I'm reading now is a comment from the Valdai Club. The Valdai Club is a Russian think tank, and they publish articles about objective financial institutions and things going on in the financial world. So here's an article about the BRICS and its transactions and the issues around the politics around these subjects of the IMF and the global financial institutions. So here it's saying no fundamental reform of the Bretton Woods institutions can be realistically expected. Incremental adjustments are possible and may improve their working, but nothing will be contemplated that alters the prevailing concentration of decision-making power in the hands of the US, the European Union, and a few other high-income countries or nations. And then the SWIFT system. The SWIFT system is it's like a messaging system that is used to make payments internationally. And this is the system that Russia was removed from when they invaded Ukraine, or they went into Ukraine in 2022. Or it started earlier than that, but it was expanded in 2022. The SWIFT system of international payments has also become a geopolitical instrument to sanction, punish, and exclude countries and entities seen as unfriendly by the West. Even official international reserves are no longer respected. So it goes on to say several countries, including Russia, Iran, Libya, Syria, Venezuela, and Afghanistan, have been victims of these sanctions and these punishments by these Western powers. So let me continue. And these countries, like China, Russia, and Iran, have set up their own interbanking messaging and payment systems as alternatives to the SWIFT, as I mentioned a minute ago. But the Russian president also has mentioned that he's saying that there's been talk of forming an alternative currency to the dollar by the BRICS nations, but it's already difficult. But as BRICS is also expanding, as 5 more join this year, which I'll mention in a while, it's becoming more difficult to think of the idea of setting up a common currency. So the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, stated that he was disappointed. He disappointed anti-colonialist enthusiasts and Western alarmists by conceding that the bloc's members have not built and are not building a payment system to challenge the US dollar-based. Well, he's not saying that they're not creating an alternative system, but the purpose of the system is not to challenge the global North or the Western countries. It's just a system being set up to allow BRICS countries to trade easier between each other. But you could argue that one of the reasons is to put almost a challenge or to bypass the Western system, as it can sometimes interfere with the running of global South countries by setting up sanctions and creating restrictions to the use of that infrastructure. Anyway, I'm going to look at the IMF and the CRA. The IMF is what it actually does. It gives assistance to countries with balance of payments problems when the difference between their imports and exports is a bit extreme, or maybe they're importing more than they can export, so they have a shortage of currency to to continue to purchase necessary items from abroad. So the IMF will come in and help assist with the balance of payments. So the CRA was set up to perform such a similar role as the IMF, although on a much smaller scale. So I'm also looking again at comments from this article from the Valdai Club, this Russian think tank, about the role of the IMF in international finance. So the IMF, as is well known, is tightly controlled by the West, i.e. the high-income nations led by the US, and routinely imposes harsh macroeconomic adjustment measures on unfriendly or unruly countries, or even excludes them altogether from emergency balance of payment support. So basically, when the West decides to punish a country, or the country is behaving in a way which the West doesn't like, then the West can use this as a form of punishment. But it's also used to restrict the growth of a country. You know, the Western powers want to remain the dominant economies in the world, so they can look for excuses to punish a country, but then the real reason is to hamper their economy, so the economies remain a bit on the weak side. Anyway, let me continue. Similarly, there is no prospect of major reform in the special drawing rights of the IMF. The SDRs, created in 1969 as a potential international currency, they have become and will remain a limited unit of accounts and reserve currency confined by US decade-long resistance to a secondary role. So this special drawing rights is something that is dominated by the US because it doesn't want to change the structure of the IMF. So the other countries have more of a say in how the IMF is run. But these special drawing rights, this explains what they are. The SDR is an international reserve asset. The SDR is not a currency, but its value is based on the basket of 5 currencies: the US dollar, the euro, the Chinese renminbi, the Japanese yen, and the British pound. And the purpose of it is that it was created by the IMF as a supplementary international reserve asset in 1969, when currencies were still tied to the price of gold, and the US dollar was the leading international reserve asset at the time. So it's saying that the IMF defined the SDR as equivalent to a fractional amount of gold that was equivalent to $1. So it was set up basically to almost like replace gold as something that is aligned to the dollar. So this SDR, and these baskets of currencies, the 5 currencies that I mentioned. So basically a currency basket is a collection of, or a set of multiple currencies with different weights. The multi-currency basket is used to determine the value of a different currency using a practice commonly known as currency peg. So that's an explanation of this currency basket and the special drawing rights of the IMF. But anyway, I'll move on. Some examples are the Asian currency unit. That's the basket of Asian currencies. The US dollar index. This is a basket of, I think, the 6 countries that I mentioned. And then the European currency, a basket of European currencies. But if we look at the CAR, this contingency reserve arrangement was set up by the 5 BRICS countries, and each had a financial input into that reserve. And I list here the 5 different amounts. China has put the majority in, which is 41 billion. Then Brazil put 18 billion, Russia 18 billion, India 18 billion, and South Africa, which is the smallest economy within those 5 BRICS countries, only put in 5 billion. And that's 100 billion, that's the revenue basically that the CRA has. And if you compare that to the capacity or the resources of the IMF, according to this from the IMF website in December 2023, their total resources are 982 billion, and their lending capacity is 695 billion. So 7 times the lending capacity. Well, I would say 9 times or almost 10 times the resource capacity, because I don't know whether the 100 billion that the BRICS has, they can actually lend that full amount. but the lending capacity of the IMF is much greater. And the fact that there's a difference, I'll look at the difference later on as to how much the IMF lends in a year, assists within a year, compared to how much the new development bank of the BRICS has actually given in a year. That's looking at comparing the World Bank to the new development bank as opposed to comparing the IMF to the CRA. So the World Bank has committed this year alone 117 billion, as opposed to the new development bank, which I'll look at later on. I think it's committed only 32 billion this year. No, 32 billion in total. I'll come back to it later on with the exact figures. But anyway, let me continue. And the next matter, or the other issue that they're looking at, is the currency, which is quite complicated, as I mentioned, because of the fact that many countries are still to join. This year alone, 5 countries have joined BRICS, so they were accepted into BRICS at the summit in Kazan, Russia, last month. I'll mention those countries in a minute, but forming a currency requires all the countries involved to have some kind of agreement to use that currency. And at the moment, BRICS is still a growing organization and it's still very unstable, so forming a new currency will be somewhat difficult for them to do. And here, according to the Carnegie Endowment Organization, this is an article from the Carnegie Endowment Organization, which is a US think tank. Although it's one of those suspicious think tanks of the US, I've decided to use the article because it provides some of the information that I was looking for. So anyway, let me look at what the article is saying. During last year's summit, that's 2023, BRICS members committed to study the feasibility of creating a common currency, but these de-dollarization efforts faced serious headwinds. Given the dollar's entrenched role in cross-border transactions, currency exchange, commodities markets, and debt denominations, the lack of financial infrastructure to facilitate non-dollar denominations transactions among BRICS central banks, and continued restrictions on the convertibility of the China currency renminbi. So there's restrictions basically on the use of national currencies for international transactions across central banks. So these are the type of structures which BRICS has not fully developed yet, and I'll talk about that in a while. And more importantly, there has been striking increase in bilateral transactions conducted in national currencies, not only between BRICS countries and between them and other developing nations, but also outside of BRICS. So there are difficulties, yes, but they are increasing bilateral transactions. But the problem with bilateral transactions is, for example, India and Russia at the moment. India has been buying a lot of oil from Russia using the Indian rupee, which Russia has accumulated a lot. But it's, from what I've been reading, they're talking about, Russia is talking about selling off rupees to a third party at a cheaper price, because it's collecting a lot of rupees from India, but it has nowhere to spend it, in terms of, because it doesn't buy a lot of goods from India. So it's trying to find a way of being able to use those rupees, and one of the options is to sell off the rupees at a cheaper price to a third party. So those are some of the issues with dealing with national currency. If the currency is not a well-known or well-used currency outside of the 2 bilateral countries that are trading in it. And Russia had proposed a currency earlier on, named after the 5 original countries that were involved. That's the 5 BRICS countries. They were going to call it the R5, but I think this idea has almost gone out of the window, since they've now recently said they're going to postpone the creation of a common currency. This is not the same as the common payment system which they're currently looking at. What I'm going to look at now is as I was saying before, this person who used to work at the the New Development Bank and the IMF mentioned in an article on the Valdai Club, this Russian think tank's website, his experiences, I should say, about what was happening within the banks and the problems that were causing the banks not to develop and grow at the rate that they should have. So what basically he has been saying, that when they started out, or in his words, let me assure you that when we started out with the CRA and the NDB, there existed considerable concern with what the BRICS were doing in this area. And okay, this is talking about some colleagues within the IMF concerned with what BRICS were doing in this area in Washington, D.C. In the IMF and the World Bank, I can testify to that because I lived there at the time, and as executive director for BRICS, for Brazil and other countries in the board of the IMF. So he's part of the board of the IMF at the time when they were becoming worried about the New Development Bank. So with the CRA, it has been frozen by 5 central banks. It remains small. It only has 5 members, and its work is hampered by numerous restrictions and safeguards. The surveillance unit we foresaw has not been established, and no balance of payment support operations are being carried out. Only tests runs, which means they've only tested the CRA, this IMF replacement or this supplementary setup that was going to be like the IMF for the BRICS nation. It has only been tested. It hasn't started fully operating yet. And I'm not going to read that part, but what he was saying basically in the article is that because of the management that came into those banks being inexperienced and lacking the skills to manage the bank properly, it hasn't grown in the way that it was supposed to grow. So this is the NDB. The bank has achieved many things but has yet to make a difference. One reason being, frankly, the type of people we have sent to Shanghai since 2015 as presidents. Okay, I did mention, and vice presidents of the institution. Brazil, for instance, during the Bolsonaro administration, sent a weak person to become a president from 2020 to 2023. Technically weak, Western orientated, and no leadership. So these are some of the reasons why the New Development Bank hasn't grown. It has been giving out loans and it has been giving assistance, but not to the extent that it could have, or it hasn't been growing probably more as rapidly as it should because it hasn't been run properly. So looking at the expansion of the BRICS now, I've just taken a brief look at the infrastructure of the institution. The 5 members that have joined this year, or that were welcomed in this year, are Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. And there are also members that also want to join, and they're saying up to 2 dozen. And these are Algeria, Azerbaijan, Bahrain. I'm not going to mention all of them. Belarus, Cuba, Kazakhstan, Nigeria, Senegal, Venezuela, and Vietnam. So a number of countries want to join BRICS, but BRICS itself is still on a more casual basis. Yes, it's doing well. Countries are joining, but the institutions that will make it run and expand properly seem to have their problems. So this is some figures regarding the share of global GDP of the 5 original countries of the BRICS. Since 2000, the G7 share of global GDP as measured by purchasing power parity has declined from 43 to 30%, while that of the 5 original BRICS countries has increased from 21% to 35%. So the BRICS countries' share of GDP is above 35%, but now 5 other countries have joined. That GDP ratio will have changed and it will be much larger than it was. A number of countries will join BRICS, but it also needs to improve its institutions so that countries can take a full advantage of what they have to offer. So according to this document from the New Development Bank, as of the end of 2022, the total amount of approved assistance is 32 billion for 96 projects, compared to the IMF, which has given a lot more. In fact, they've given more than 30, it's 117 billion just this year alone, just 2024 alone. So it has given more than 3 times the amount in this year alone than the New Development Bank has given in its entirety since its existence has started. So looking at these organizations, these structures of the BRICS, I would say that BRICS as an infrastructure is growing, but it still faces the challenges of proper organization. And as I mentioned in my previous program, I don't know whether BRICS is really going to provide an alternative global structure to the Western-led individualistic mindset-based structure, because many of these countries, even within the BRICS, their economies are based on the same technologies, or they're getting involved in these same technologies as that you find in the West, this artificial intelligence and the robotics and so forth. All of those technologies will also be incorporated in a lot of the global South. So you have to wonder as to whether this BRICS idea, I think it needs something completely. No, BRICS to a certain extent will provide an infrastructure for people who are being punished by the West. But in terms of taking the world in a different direction and the economies of the world in a new direction, I don't think BRICS is the right setup for that, as many of the countries that are even coming into the BRICS setup still trade a lot with the West, and I don't think they want to separate themselves from the West too much. So yeah, that's a look at the BRICS economics, their version of the IMF, which still has a long way to go, and their version of the World Bank also, which has a long way to go. So that is it for now.